Hi everyone, and welcome to Stories to Warm the Heart. My name is Chloe, and I am joining you this evening to read a few short stories that I hope will warm your heart, will bring some joy to the end of your day. So I'm gonna just go ahead and get started here. The first short story I have for you tonight is titled The Redbirds. My oldest sister left home in October 1969 when she was just 18 years old to join her husband in Alaska. Brenda and Jimmy, high school sweethearts, had married 6 months earlier. They were hardly back from their honeymoon when the dreaded envelope arrived in the mail. The official draft notice. Due to Jimmy's excellent typing skills, he received his orders to report for office duty in Alaska immediately after basic training. The 49th state seemed a million miles away from our hometown of Albertville, Alabama, but compared to the raging conflict in Vietnam, the snow and ice sounded just fine. He left for the frigid state in August and sent a ticket for Brenda to join him 2 months later. I was 3 years old that breezy day when I watched my sister board the gigantic airplane that would take her farther away from our small southern town than any of us had ever traveled before. Tears ran down Mama's face while Daddy turned away and wiped his misty eyes with a white handkerchief. I waved and waved as the airplane soared out of sight, and although I couldn't see Brenda returning my gesture, I knew she was. During the days that followed, every time I stepped outside and heard the roar of a jet overhead, I jumped up and down yelling, "It's Brenda! It's Brenda!" I kept my arm in the air until all traces of the plane disappeared from sight, and then went to bed happy that night to have seen the aircraft transporting my sister. I'd never entered my young head that there was more than one airplane in the world. In my toddler eyes, Brenda was still a passenger of the friendly skies circling the clouds above my head. About a week after my sister left, our postman, Mr. Mabry, rang the front door and hand-delivered an envelope covered in funny-looking stamps. It was our first letter from Alaska. Mama read it at least 50 times that afternoon. I liked the last part the best because it contained some very important words, especially for me. Tell Sandy that every time she sees a redbird, I'll be thinking of her. Brenda and I loved anything red, especially the scarlet-colored birds often seen fluttering about in our shaded backyard. I was ecstatic when I rushed out the back door and a stately cardinal flew right past my smiling face and perched atop a glider underneath a large pine tree. Surely Brenda had sent it straight from her new home to let me know I wasn't forgotten. Mr. Mabry came often to our door, personally delivering every correspondence my sister sent to us. He had once been in the military and knew how important those letters were to waiting families. In my innocence, I had no idea how the mail system worked, and I really believed our devoted carrier traveled to Alaska each week to place our letter in my sister's hands and bring hers back to us. "Please take me with you," I begged on more than one occasion. He just shook his head and said it was too cold up there for me. And besides, his boss wouldn't allow passengers in the mail truck. I was disappointed, but still thrilled when he promised to give Brenda my envelope covered in childish scribbling and rudimentary drawing of stick birds colored a deep crimson. I saw many redbirds while my sister was gone, and I talked to the ones close enough to hear my wishes. I whispered, begging them to fly back and ask my favorite sibling how much longer she was going to be away. I desperately wanted her to return home because she'd been my best friend for as long as I could remember, and her absence left a hole in my heart that just couldn't be filled by anyone else. I will never forget that day in May 1971 when a whole family of redbirds filled the dogwood tree in our yard. I stood under the blooming branches and I couldn't help thinking that Brenda must be trying to tell me something. I rushed into the house and skidded to a stop as I entered the kitchen. Mama was crying and sobbing loudly. I knew whatever it was that made her shed that many tears had to be pretty bad. Fearing the worst, I wrapped my arms around her waist and I held on tight, bracing myself for the impending disaster. "She's coming home! Sandy, your sister is coming home!" she said in broken sobs. I knew it! Brenda was trying to send a message to me. She had sent the flock of redbirds all the way from Alaska to Alabama to let me know she would be returning soon. Excitedly, I marked the days off with a big X on the calendar, hanging in the den. The night before her scheduled arrival, my excitement was so great I could barely sleep. For the rest of my life, I will never forget that beautiful summer day when the burgundy 1967 Pontiac GTO pulled into our graveled driveway. The sun was shining and redbirds seemed to be everywhere when Brenda knelt down and gathered me into her arms. I held on tight and vowed to never let her go again. 32 years later, my sister and I live about 3 miles apart, high atop beautiful Sand Mountain in the same town where we were born and raised. We talk on the phone daily, visit often, and still send our love to each other through the redbirds. The end. That short story again was titled The Redbirds. Do any of you out there have a favorite color? Do you have maybe something that you share in common with a sibling or someone close to you? Whenever you see that, it brings back that memory of them. I certainly do with my little sisters. All right, I have another short story for all you wonderful people out there, and this one is titled The Macrame Curtains. As I straightened the pillows on my faded green sofa, I noticed another rip. I had already made new cover for the loose cushions. Now the permanent cushions on the back were beginning to go. We couldn't afford to have it reupholstered, and we certainly couldn't afford a new one. But there was no time to fret over it now. The women's group at the church was about to begin. My husband had been the pastor of the church for 3 years, just enough time for a pastor's family to feel really comfortable in a church. Small towns in central Illinois are quiet, and everyone knows everyone else. Mason was no different. 1/10 of the population attended our church, and during our tenure, I learned much about our community. I didn't especially enjoy the women's group meetings. It was so easy for some of the ladies to fall into gossip that I had become an expert at responding with nonverbal grunts and sighs that neither agreed with negative comments nor reprimanded the gossiper. Changing the subject was my favorite way of dealing with the situation. Today I changed the subject by asking, does anyone have any creative ways of covering up a worn sofa? My question turned the gossipers into sofa experts, and I ended up with a wealth of ideas. An hour and a half later, the president declared the meeting over and directed us towards the desserts. With cherry cheesecake on a crystal plate decorated with a lace doily and coffee in a china cup, I was ready to reward myself for avoiding the day's gossip with such finesse when Sue Chambers sat down beside me. Sue, a woman my father would have described as a bit high-strung, was married to the local doctor. They lived just down the street from our parsonage in a pristine English Tudor with ivy growing up the walls. They were the only people I know who hired a gardener. Sue seemed particularly agitated. Apparently, the decorator who had done their home had put curtains in the small windows on each side of their front door. But Sue hadn't checked the fiber content before washing them, and the curtains had shrunk to nearly half their original size. "What will I do?" she asked. "I can't tell my friends how stupid I was. That decorator has moved, and I'll never be able to replace them. I'm so upset." The 70s was the height of the macrame era, and I was a macrame queen. So I casually commented that natural macrame hangings would look great in her windows. I added that I'd be glad to do them for her. I hadn't expected her to accept my offer, but to my surprise, she called the next day and asked if I'd been serious. Panic set in. Would I do a good enough job for a house that had been decorated by a professional? Setting aside my fears, I went to work, and the curtains were finished and hung within the week. Sue was thrilled. 2 weeks later, the Victorian doorbell of our antiqued home rang, and there stood Sue. She was not the type of person to just drop in for a visit, so my mind raced. Did the curtains fall? Did her husband object? Smiling, she pulled out the package she was holding behind her back and handed it to me. "I just wanted to truly thank you for the curtains." I protested, telling her that I enjoyed making the curtains for her and wanted nothing in return. But instead of listening to me, she pulled out a card and asked me to read it. As I read, tears stung my eyes. "Everyone thinks because we're the doctor's family and have a little money, we don't need anything. No one has ever done anything for me. You gave me more than curtains." When I had finished, I leaned over and hugged her. The note was all the thanks I needed. "Now look in the bag," she said excitedly. I stuck my hand in the bag and pulled out a Gucci purse. Wow! I had never had a designer purse. Sue seemed more excited than I. Like a little girl passing out Christmas presents, she cried, "Open the purse and look inside!" I began to pull one thing after another out of the purse. Perfume from France, a handkerchief from Switzerland, and a teeny 100-year-old book of prayers that had been purchased in an antique shop in London. After pulling out the last treasure, I was speechless. All I could say was, You shouldn't have." A frown crossed her face. "Did you check the bottom?" There was more? I thought I had emptied it, but there in the bottom of the purse was a roll of bills. I unrolled them and counted 5 $100 bills. Tears welled up in my eyes again. This was too much. I held the money out to her. "I really don't want to be paid for doing something for you." Quietly, she pushed my hand away and replied, "I heard you say you needed a new sofa, and I want to do that for you." The fact that she had remembered my aging sofa caused more tears to cascade down my cheeks. Last summer, I received an invitation to return to that little town in Illinois to speak at a reunion. As I drove around the town square, I was amazed that 25 years hadn't changed things very much. It was as if time had bypassed this community. My mind went back to Sue Chambers, and I couldn't resist the urge to drive down the block to her ivy-covered home. When I pulled into the drive, tears began to flow. There, on each side of the door, were the little windows still covered with the macrame curtains. The end. That was the macrame curtains. Oh, how the smallest gesture can really brighten someone's day, huh? Have you ever done something like that? Went out of your way to make someone something and realized how much it meant to them, even just something you thought was so little? If you haven't, maybe give it a try sometime. All right, everybody, I have one final story for you, and this one is titled A Special Cup of Coffee. Several years ago, when I was a special agent with a U.S. federal law enforcement agency, I stopped at a McDonald's restaurant just off Highway 61, now I-55, in southeast Missouri, very near my hometown of Scott City, Missouri. When I left home in 1955, the population had been approximately 300, and the name of the town had been Ancel. The memory that ensued made such an impression on me that I made a journal entry recording the story, and have since read and reread it during times in my life when my soul needed uplifting. Early on that foggy, drizzly morning, just a little past daybreak, I was on an investigation, traveling I-55 near Scott City, when I saw a warm, welcoming McDonald's sign and pulled in for a cup of coffee. The fast food restaurant was jam-packed. I could barely hear myself speak when placing my order. The high volume of noise was due to the loud din of conversation and an overheard corner TV that blared information about local basketball playoffs. Most of the customers appeared to be farmers. They milled about in their John Deere and co-op caps, discussing much-needed rain and the basketball playoffs, joking, laughing, and shouting to be heard. That particular Golden Arches stop was obviously a popular gathering place for the neighborhood's friendly, early-rising community members. Unfortunately, I saw no one I recognized from my past. Finding a single table off in a corner, I sat down to have my coffee. I was glancing at the local paper when an even louder noise grabbed my attention. I looked around to see a small boy pushing a child's high chair past me. The casters on the chair made a harsh racket, rolling over the tiled floor as he made his way to the only vacant table left in the restaurant. His mother, carrying a teeny baby wrapped in a blanket, was followed by the father. The family sat down, and the little boy asked, "I can pray?" The father smiled and nodded. Immediately, the room quieted. A pin dropping to the floor could have been heard through the restaurant. All discussions, joking, and laughter stopped. The TV was silenced and head apparel promptly removed. The entire restaurant was hushed. The only sound was the precious child's voice raised in prayer. After a long list of thank yous, he asked God to bless and keep his mommy, daddy, baby sister, grandma, and pa. Then his sweet, innocent voice whispered, "Amen." Long moments after the prayer ended, there remained an extended and respectful silence. Curious, I raised my bowed head and looked around. It was apparent to me that in addition to our dear God, to whom the prayer was specifically addressed, everyone in the restaurant had heard and was touched by the little boy and his prayer. To an individual, everyone wore a warm and proud smile. Some so moved by this heartwarming scene, reminiscent of one of Norman Rockwell's finest paintings, shed tears. I was one of those, and I felt proud to be back home again, where hearing a child's prayer was far more important than all other conversations or newscasts. The end. That was a special cup of coffee. Well, everyone, I really hope that you enjoyed my short stories this evening. I hope they warmed your heart, brought you a little joy at the end of your day. Now, I wish you all a wonderful rest of your evening. Take care out there, everybody. I'll see you again next time. Good night and goodbye.